So the other day, me and my friend were, me and a friend of mine we were discussing the Iliad, and one problem that, like both of us noticed, was that the Iliad by itself is a story within a story. It doesn't really tell the full story. Like it's a story about a few weeks during the 10-year long Trojan War. And like it doesn't really go into detail as to what led to the war, why these two parties went to war, and perhaps even more problematically, it ends before there is any kind of real resolution to the war. Like during the whole of the Iliad, it keeps telling us, oh, Achilles will die, Achilles will die, Achilles will die before the end of this war. And how does the Iliad end? It ends with Achilles still alive, and the war hasn't come to an end. The fabled city of Troy still exists. Its walls haven't been breached. So there's no like sense of closure. It's like you're left hanging. Like imagine going to a movie and the movie ends, you don't know, and when the movie ends, you don't know like how the story ends. It's like well, that happens a lot of times in movies, but there's always a sequel that kind of ends the movie. But the Iliad by itself, doesn't really tell the whole story. And there is a sequel, it's the Odyssey, but the Odyssey also doesn't really go in detail into, how the war ended or any of that. So, with that in mind, I thought I'm thinking of doing like a 3-part video series. In the first part of the series, I'll kind of go into like some detail into the events that lead to the Iliad. The second video, I'll kind of like summarize the events of the Iliad, and in the third video, I'll go into like what happened after, like how did the war end. There's like some famous events that are not part of the Iliad, like the whole story of the Trojan horse, the story of Cassandra. In modern pop culture, like a lot of people have heard of Cassandra because of the song by ABBA, but do they really know like why ABBA even sang about Cassandra? you know like the Trojan horse, like in software there's actually a word, it's called Trojans. So where did this word come from? How many people know the story of the Trojan horse? And what about Helen? She's supposed to be the face that launched 1,000 ships. Like how does she figure into this story? Like what's the like like some background details about her, other than oh, she was the face that launched 1,000 stories, the Greeks and the Trojans went to war over Helen. But like why, what led to all that? Some background about Achilles as well. All that is missing from the Iliad. So let's go into some of that. The Iliad, by the way, it begins with the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon in the 10th year of the Trojan War. And it ends pretty much with Achilles returning Hector's body to his grieving father, Priam. A lot of things happen in between, and a lot of things happen afterwards and before as well. So this is what happened before. This is what leads to the events of the Iliad. So it all starts. How shall I put this? This is a story that involves both gods and humans. Behind the scenes, like, the gods are pretty active. And so, like, some people might have a problem with that aspect of the story, because a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, the Trojan War really happened. Hey, here's the city of Troy. It's buried under 20 levels in this place in Turkey somewhere. So they'll be like, oh yeah, historically, yeah, maybe the Trojan War really happened, but you can't really prove that about the gods, the existence of the gods. You can't really prove that. So a lot of people might have, problem with that part of the story. But to tell the story, properly in its proper context, you do have to tell that part of the story as well, the part involving the gods. So the story actually starts in the hallway of the gods. There's like some sort of party going on, and like all the gods are invited except for one. Some goddess, I forget her name. By the way, all the details that I have about this story come from a book called Greeks and Trojans that I read years and years and years ago, and I do recollect most of the salient features of this story, but I might not remember, certain names here and there, especially of, minor characters, if you'll let me call them minor characters. So the story, as I said, it begins with a banquet. There's a party in the party room, I suppose, of the gods. All the gods and goddesses are invited except for one. So naturally she gets upset and decides to take her revenge. So in Greek mythology, you'll find, that the gods and the goddesses, they kind of do behave like we do. Some of them, on occasion, they do behave rather pettily. So this particular goddess, upset at not being invited to this party, decides to take her revenge. She sends an apple to this party, famously called the apple of discord. It's a golden apple. And alongside the apple, she sends a note. And the note goes, "This apple shall be presented to the most beautiful goddess in attendance." Now, this creates, what do you think it creates? It creates drama. Because, naturally, there's a lot of goddesses there, and, if you choose one goddess over another as the most beautiful, then the other goddesses will be upset. And so no one wants to, be the final judge and say, hey, this goddess is the most beautiful, so she deserves, this apple. And then they do narrow it down to like 3 prominent goddesses. Hera, the goddess of strength and power. Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love. They narrow it down to these 3 goddesses and say, one of these 3 must be the most beautiful goddess in attendance here. But fearful perhaps of the goddess's wrath or vengeance, or, of whichever goddesses don't get the golden apple, even the gods, they will not take a final decision as to who is the most beautiful. So they say, let's let a human take this call. And the human they choose to take this call is the unfortunate Paris. Fortunate or unfortunate, I guess that may or may not be a point of view. And you can be you can judge based on the facts that I shall present. So, here let's take a brief departure to go into who Paris was. In the city of Troy, it's a city surrounded by walls, unbreachable, impregnable walls. It's a city protected by these walls. Long ago, Hercules or Heracles, however you pronounce it, however you want to call him, apparently stormed the city of Troy because of some sort of insult or whatever. And think he killed the king or whoever, was in charge of that city. And I think he put like a young boy called Priam on the throne of Troy. And he may or may not have built the walls that surround Troy. Either it was him or some gods built those walls. But Hercules did storm the city of Troy, and he did install Priam, a young boy called Priam, as its king before leaving the city. And I believe he may have taken Priam's sister with him. So Priam grows up, Troy prospers. Priam has like about 20 children. Most famous of those 20 would be Hector and Paris. Now, when Paris was born, some oracles made some prophecies regarding Paris. They foretold that Paris would be the cause, the reason behind the destruction of Troy, and they advised Priam and his wife to kill Paris so as to avoid the destruction of the city. Now, Priam, being a wise king, does give in to the advice of these sages, these oracles. But also being a parent, he can't do the deed himself, so he entrusts this task to one of his trusted advisors. Now, this trusted advisor also proves to not be hard-hearted enough to, kill an innocent baby. So instead, what he does is takes the baby Paris, to some hills, to some rural hills outside the city of Troy, and he just leaves them there, in the midst of the goats and the whatnot that are on those mountains or hills. He returns to the city and he tells the king that, I took care of, that little task you entrusted to me. So Priam and his wife, and the, rest of the people of Troy go along their business, thinking that Paris is dead and the city is safe. But actually, Paris, he grows up in the mountains, marries, I forget the name of his wife, but his first wife, but apparently she does have some healing powers. She's good with herbs and stuff. And, Paris is living, happily in the mountains of Troy, the mountains, on the outskirts of Troy. Yeah, I don't think at this stage he even knows about his heritage. And one fine day, 3 goddesses appear before him, and in their birthday suits. This is how the story is told. They appear before him bringing an apple, and they ask him to decide who amongst those 3 is the most beautiful of them all. Now, apparently, all 3 of the goddesses are so beautiful that Paris cannot decide. And so now the goddesses get to bribing him. So Hera says, I'm the goddess of strength and power, and if you vote for me as the most beautiful, I will make you like an unstoppable warrior. Everyone will kneel before you. You will win every battle. Every city will fall to you. Hearing this, Paris almost gives the apple to Hera, but before he can, Athena interrupts him, and she says, I'm the goddess of wisdom, and wisdom trumps strength. If you give this apple to me, I'll make you the wisest person in all of the known world. And so now Paris is torn. It's like, do I give the apple to Hera or do I give it to Athena? And then Aphrodite speaks, and she's like, in like a sweet, melodious voice. She's like, forget strength, forget power, forget wisdom. If you give the apple to me, I will give you the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. This woman, of course, is Helen. And apparently, as the story goes, like upon hearing this, Paris's knees go weak. Knees turn to jelly. His insides melt. He promptly gives the apple to Aphrodite, instantly making enemies of both Hera and Athena, and making friends of course, Aphrodite. So later on, when the war between the Greeks and the Trojans does happen, Hera and Athena will be on the side of the Greeks, out of hatred for Paris, as well as out of love for some other subjects, and Odysseus, for one, being one of Athena's favorites. And Aphrodite will take the side of the Trojans out of love for Paris. So now the judgment of Paris has been rendered. The apple goes to Aphrodite. She's declared the most beautiful of all. And Paris sets about to getting Helen. So by now he's aware of his heritage too, so he goes to Troy, presents himself before the king, and says, I'm your son, I'm your long-lost son, here to, reclaim or to lay claim to my princely titles and rights. And by now, Priam and, the people of Troy, I guess, have forgotten about the prophecy, or, don't pay any heed to it anymore. They're just happy to see Paris has grown into a fine young man. They're like, wow, it's good to have him here. It's grown into a fine young man, and we're happy to have him here. The prophecy must have been, a load of nonsense in any case. So, So they give him back his royal titles, and one fine day he sails to a city in Troy. A city in Greece. Kingdom in Greece. The king there being Menelaus, and his wife, the queen, being Helen. So here, uh, let's take a pause, a stop, a detour, and go into the story of Helen for a bit, because that's also like really, really important. Initially, like this is, the part of the story before the happenings of the Iliad. Pretty much the two most important characters are Paris and Helen. So now that we have Paris's backstory, we need to know Helen's backstory. So apparently, Helen's father is none other than Zeus himself, the king of gods. Apparently, in the shape of a swan or something. He has intercourse with Helen's mother, is married to some king, and eventually Helen is born out of that. Helen grows up, stunningly beautiful and all that, and it comes time to marry her off. So her poor father doesn't know who to marry her off to, so calls a gathering of, eligible princes and kings. So he can decide, who to give the hand of Helen to. And this is a gathering like none other in ancient Greece. Like kings and princes come from all over. This Ajax, the giant of a man, this Odysseus, considered one of the wisest men in Greece. There's Menelaus, there's Achilles, the greatest warrior alive. I'll go into a little bit of detail on Achilles too in today's video. And several other, like who's who gather for this engagement. And Helen's poor father is at a loss, like, who do I give her hand to? He doesn't want to offend, one powerful king or prince by giving her hand to another. Or he doesn't want to offend many powerful kings and princes by giving her hand to just one. So eventually a suggestion pops up. I think the suggestion comes from Odysseus. He says, let Helen herself decide who she wants to marry, and before she makes a choice, let us all vow to honor her choice and to protect and defend her and her husband if the need should arise. So everyone agrees to Odysseus's suggestion. Helen ends up choosing, I believe he's described as golden-haired Menelaus, younger brother of Agamemnon. So that's that. Helen and Menelaus get married, and they sail off to whatever small kingdom Menelaus is king of. Like this is a time when Greece was divided into hundreds of small kingdoms, some more powerful than others. And of course, one fine day, Paris comes along on a diplomatic visit. Menelaus and Helen greet him. And I guess in those days, visits last for weeks or months. And, sometime into the visit, Menelaus has to go away for some business or stuff of that nature. Helen's left alone with Menelaus. Helen's left alone with Paris. And by the time Menelaus returns, he finds that his home is empty. Helen has eloped or been abducted by Paris and gone to Troy. And this, of course, is, the seed for the war, the beginnings of the war or the reason for the war, The seed for the war has basically been planted. So Menelaus is really upset. He wants to, set sail for Troy and kill Paris and bring Helen back or kill her too, depending on, whether she was abducted or eloped, or, his state of being at the time. He goes to Agamemnon for help, and Agamemnon is like, wait, let's not do this together. Let's assemble a force. let's call a gathering of, let's call to our aid all the kings and princes who were at Helen's wedding and who promised to come to her in your aid if the need should ever arise. Lo and behold, the need has arisen. So let's not do this on our own. Let's call for help. And the cry for help goes out, and kings and princes in their turn do respond to that call for aid. And so this gathering, once again, like none other, this time a war gathering, as the Greeks get set to sail Troy. I guess I could go into Achilles a little bit here. So of course, as you're about to attack Troy, the one warrior you really want on your side is Achilles, who would be your greatest warrior. Achilles is also like half divine. His mother is the goddess Thetis, water goddess or water nymph Thetis. His father was Peleus, also like a great hero during his day. And let's start with the story of Thetis. So it's also quite interesting. Apparently, it's prophesied of her that she is destined to bear a son greater than his father. So apparently Zeus, king of gods himself, wanted Thetis as his wife, but due to this prophecy, he got scared off. This prophecy scared him off, because Zeus himself overthrew his father Cronus to, become the king of gods, and so he doesn't want to be overthrown by his son. So due to this reason, he does not, in fact, marry Thetis, and the gods decide to marry her off to a mortal, because, they're scared of just how strong and powerful her son might be if she's married to, a divine god. So they marry her off to a mortal, Peleus. And out of that union comes Achilles, the greatest warrior of his time. So the prophecy does come out to be true. And of Achilles, it's said that, there's a lot of stories and myths surrounding Achilles too. One of them being that he was invulnerable in every part of his body except his heel, because his mother Thetis used to dip him when he was a baby. She used to dip him in like a river, like some holy river of the gods, which made every part of his body invulnerable except for his heels. Like she grabbed him by the heels when she dipped him in the water, so the water never touched his heels, and so his heels were his one weakness. That's one of the myths surrounding Achilles, and of course the term Achilles heel has found its way into pop culture as well. Another story about Achilles is that he was presented a choice. He could live a long, happy life, but an ultimately unmemorable one that people would forget about soon after his demise. Or he could choose to live a young, tumultuous life, but along with that young and tumultuous life would come fame everlasting. People would remember him long, long, long after he was gone. And, when we're young, we're hot-blooded, we lust after fame and glory. And so Achilles, despite the entreaties of his mother, chooses the short life that will eventually lead to, everlasting fame or long-lasting fame, rather than, the long and happy but ultimately unmemorable life. Also, it's said of Achilles that, at the time this call came for help from Menelaus and Agamemnon, his mother sent him off into hiding because she knew that if he went to Troy, he would never return. And there's that story. He hides amongst women dressed as a woman in some court. But eventually, they find him, and secret comes out that this girl hidden here, pretending to be a girl, is actually Achilles. Eventually, the secret does come out. It's another story for another time, I suppose. I won't tell it here. So eventually, Achilles also responds to the call for aid, and along with his friend Patroclus and his warriors known as the Myrmidons, he joins the armada against the Trojans. Now, as all these Greek kings and princes gather on the shores of Greece to set sail for Troy, one problem arises. They don't get favorable winds, so they're waiting and waiting and waiting, for like these favorable winds so they can set sail for Troy, but the winds never arise, and so now once again they take the help of oracles and sages who let Agamemnon know that the only way they're going to get favorable winds is if they make like a sacrifice to the gods. And so Agamemnon does make that sacrifice. The sacrifice is none other than like his youngest daughter. He calls her over to where all the ships are, under the pretense that he's going to marry her off to Achilles. And so it's quite possible that, Achilles doesn't even know that his name has been used as pretense. So she comes over and, just as she thinks she's about to get married, she's actually sacrificed to the gods. And this sacrifice will prove expensive to Agamemnon himself in the coming days, months, years. But yeah, the Greeks, they do get their favorable winds. They set off for Troy. One other event I'll mention before the Greeks land on the shores of Troy. They make a lot of brief pit stops along the small scattered islands along the way, and one of these islands they leave behind the prodigy of Hercules. By this time Hercules is long dead. But his bow and arrows he left to his prodigy. I forget his name. And apparently it's fated that Troy will not fall unless the bow and arrows of Hercules himself are present during, the battle for it. So his prodigy with the bow and arrows is left on one of these islands because he was bitten by a snake, and they couldn't see him recovering, or no one there was skilled enough to help him recover. So they leave him here for about 10 years while he suffers horrible pain and anguish while the Greeks are off fighting the Trojans for 10 long years. So eventually the Greeks, they land on the shores of Troy. They set up camp, and they start their attack on Troy, and the battle goes on for 10 long years. Troy itself is protected by its walls, but a lot of surrounding kingdoms and villages the Greeks managed to plunder. Achilles is at the forefront of all this, and one of the prizes of war, shall we say, is Briseis, who is given to Achilles as a trophy. And she's gonna come into play come the events of the Iliad. So I'm gonna end this particular video here. In the next video, I'll go into the events of the Iliad, and in the video after that, I'll go into what happens after the Iliad. So, hopefully you stuck around till the end. If you did, appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.